Yep.
Okay. Hello. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up. We'll be talking about the topic of my book, Lost Wonderland, amusement park that was in Revere from 1906 until 1910. I just wanted to give a quick plug to my other book, Sandbows and Blacklights. This will be coming out from Oxford University Press next month. It's a follow-up to How the Ray Gun Got Its Zap. Okay, and let's begin the slideshow here. Just a second. Let me stop the share there. All right. Okay. Share screen. And slideshow from the beginning. Okay. As I say, thank you very much for showing up. Here's my book, Lost Wonderland. This is about the amusement park that existed in Revere from 1906 until 1910. It was a sort of proto-Disneyland, and it was one of the largest amusement parks in the area. In fact, even in the country at the time. Here's your admission ticket. This park was built at a time when amusement parks were a brand new thing. People had been to the World's Fairs. There were so many new things from like the Chicago World's Fair. And in 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair, they introduced all sorts of new kinds of foods and things and exhibits. And the Midways provided all these great rides. In Coney Island in New York, 3 amusement parks had opened up and were competing with each other for customers. Dreamland, Steeplechase Park, and Luna Park. And other cities saw this and figured they would like to try and get in on this. There already was one in the Massachusetts, 2, in fact, in the Massachusetts area. There's Norumbega Park out to the west, and there's Paragon Park that had opened up in 1904 down in Hull. But they were not particularly easy to reach. Most of these parks were built by absolute amateurs. They had not done this before because there weren't things like this that had generally been done. And many of them, only a couple of years previously, had not been involved in anything like amusement parks at all. And that's typical of the man who started up Wonderland. It was a man named John Joseph Higgins. John Joseph Higgins wasn't even in Boston. He was living in Savannah, Georgia, where he was the treasurer at the Morehouse Manufacturing Company that made 3 different varieties of baking powder. I don't know why 3 different ones: Success, Railroad, and Battle Axe. And for reasons too complex to get into right now, the baking powder companies joined together to form a collective at this time, the American Baking Powder Association, and they elected Higgins as the president. He seems to have been more of a figurehead. He didn't actually do anything much there, but it got him out of Savannah, Georgia. It got him traveling to New York and Washington and elsewhere. And I suspect he either met people from Boston or he may have gone up to Boston at this time, because almost inexplicably, he moved in 1903 to Chelsea and changed his business completely from being the treasurer of a baking powder company to being a real estate agent. I suspect that what caused him to come up here was that he met Helena Frances Welch, because shortly after he came up, they got married. And that's the sort of thing that can get somebody to move somewhere else. He joined the real estate firm of James A. McCann, and for the next couple of years, he traded real estate. He came across one tract of land that was particularly interesting. This is the way it was laid out with streets that were never built, from Brewster up to Hanover there. It was bracketed by 2 different lines that were owned by the Boston and Maine Railroad. You can see them on either side there. And the main reason that this wasn't built, besides the fact that the railroads made it kind of inaccessible, was that most of this was actually marshland. And several times during the year, it would get flooded. So it was hard to persuade people to build there. But Higgins saw this and thought, this is the perfect place to put in an amusement park. There are 23 acres that were very close to Boston. Revere Beach had just become developed at this point. This was the time when they turned it into America's first beach park. They put Revere Beach Boulevard in the top. They had the narrow gauge railroad coming in there, and the narrow gauge railroad was easy to get to from Boston. You took a ferry across to East Boston side, you got on there, and it would take you all the way up to Point of Pines. And later on, it would take you all the way up to Lynn. So it had easy transportation. It was much easier to get to than any place else. It seemed the perfect place to put a park. The problem is Higgins didn't know anything about amusement parks. Somehow or other, he found Floyd C. Thompson, who is a fascinating individual. Floyd Chaddock Thompson was only a couple years previously a pharmacist in upstate New York, not far from Albany. But he became obsessed with incorporation. He founded several companies doing several different kinds of business, and he got into the entertainment business, and that's where he thought he really had his calling. He, along with his fellow corporate men, raised capital of $1.5 million at a time when that was a huge amount of money. And they organized the Stadium Company, which was trying to build the largest amusement park ever built. They arranged to buy up the land from Steeplechase Park in Coney Island and the land around it, and they're just going to simply outclass everybody else. Unfortunately, the deal fell through. They lost all their money. His companies all went bankrupt, and his marriage appears to have broken up. And that you would think would be the end of it. But at this point, he met Higgins. And although he didn't have much by way of money, and although he had apparently failed in all these businesses, he did have two things. He knew how to make corporations and get money from people to get them going. And he had what we would call a Rolodex of all the entertainment venues, all the people who had rides, all the acts. He knew how to get the entertainment there. So he basically took over the running of the park. The first thing he did was he moved the Wonderland headquarters from the Pemberton building on Beacon Hill to a much more prestigious Boston Stock Exchange building on 53 State Street, still there. And he corralled a group of investors. He got the State Highway Commissioner, Harold S. Parker, to be the president. He found Thomas Barrell to be the next in charge. And they arranged this cadre of railroad and mine owning men that all invested in it. Most of the money that funded Wonderland came from Lake Superior copper and from Eastern Kentucky coal and the railroads that shipped them around. They drew up plans for what was to be Wonderland. It was going to be called the Wonderland Amusement Park and County Fair originally, and this is the conceptual drawing from December of 1905. The 8 buildings all arranged around the central circle there on the left-hand side, that was going to be the county fair part. That would be the counterpart to a World's Fair. They would have exhibits of not only animals, but also cunning inventions, not only from New England, from all over the country, ideally. And then to the right-hand side, the bulk of the park would be like the midway from one of the World's Fairs. And you'd have all the latest rides. They're all represented there, the Shoot-the-Chutes, the Fire and Flame show, and what was going to be a real coup, they had gotten hold of the inventor and the rights to the big hit of the St. Louis World's Fair, a ride called Creation. Henry Voltaire was a magician turned ride inventor, and he used all sorts of tricks and sleight of hand to tell the story of the creation of the world. It was so popular that they rebuilt it on a somewhat smaller scale in Dreamland on Coney Island, and now Boston was going to have its own version. Something happened, and I don't know exactly what it was, but they lost Henry Voltaire in Creation, and they hurriedly redesigned the park, completely flipping everything around. And they came up with a new conceptual sketch only 2 months later. And this is what the sketch looked like. And this is ultimately what the park ended up looking pretty much like. They have the Shoot-the-Chutes facing towards the ocean now, and a lot of the other rides are still there. You would think that with a radical change like that, they had to change the construction company too, that it would be a long time before it was built and things would come in late. But no, they were able actually to get the entire park built by opening day, which is going to be Memorial Day in 1906. To get around the problem of the swamp, they put the entire park on a boardwalk raised 2 to 3 feet above the level. And to make sure the buildings didn't sink in there, they drove in 60,000 spruce pilings to give a firm foundation for the buildings. So on May 30th, 1906, it was supposed to open at noon, but there were so many people there that they were storming the gates and they had to open it earlier. This is the beachside entrance, but the main entrance was over on Walnut Street. This is the main building here. That was not only the main entrance, it was also the administration building. They had the restrooms in there. And on the right-hand side, they had a children's creche, so you could leave your children there while you visited the park. You can see some of the things over the top of the buildings there, and over on the left, you can see a building labeled Infant Incubator. We'll get to that shortly. This is the view from the inside of the park. That's the inside of the administration building. Right in the foreground there at the lower left is the lagoon, the splashdown lagoon for the Shoot-the-Chutes. And that bridge is a bridge over one of the side canals. The Shoot-the-Chutes was the centerpiece of the park, as it was at many parks. But Wonderland's Shoot-the-Chutes was different. It was the biggest Shoot-the-Chutes in the world. They'd bought it from the St. Louis World's Fair. It had a tower that was 85 feet tall, and the chute itself was 340 feet long. This is a bit like the Boston Tea Party ride at Canopy Lake Park, if you've been there, but it had a significant difference. This is double barreled for one thing, so it had two cars that could go up at the same time, and then they could drop down into the water. But it came down so rapidly, and the car was so light that it would skim across the surface of the water like a thrown stone. It would actually get airborne, as you can see in that shot there. But yet the people didn't get wet. This is back in the just after the Victorian era, and people were very proper. You didn't want to have people get wet in the park, even though that's the big attraction with the Boston Tea Party now. Anyway, this was an exhilarating ride. Like I said, it's a very big one. The biggest Shoot-the-Chutes that there was in the country. This is the view from the top of the Shoot-the-Chutes. You got a spectacular view of the entire park looking eastward. You can see the splashdown pool there at the base. You can see many of the buildings on the right and on the left. In the distance, in the background, you can see the hotels and other attractions along Revere Beach Boulevard. And beyond that is Broad Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. To one side of the entrance was the infant incubator and hospital in this faux Elizabethan half-timbered building. Now, an infant incubator sounds like a very weird thing to be in an amusement park, but again, you have to remember this was trying to be both an amusement park and a World's Fair type of thing. Martin A. Cooney was sort of an evangelist for baby incubators. At the time, incubators were not in hospitals. The doctors thought it was not worth trying to save premature infants. But Cooney was on a crusade to try and save as many as possible. He set up his infant incubators at World's Fairs and later on at amusement parks. He charged people admission, and he was unapologetic about these being at entertainment venues. He would take the money and plow it right back into the operation. He had a full-time doctor, he had nurses there, and he had the latest incubators. And I thought maybe they didn't really have premature babies, but no, they were all premature infants in these. This shows you the interior of the one at Wonderland. You can see he had several of them set up there. They would have ribbons, pink for girls, blue for boys. You could watch them being changed and fed, and people were restrained by the barriers there. Cooney had already demonstrated this at a trade fair in 1903, and it was so popular that the Austin and Stone's Dime Museum copied it. They ran it for a month, and then they tried to put one up on Revere Beach, and they were immediately shut down by the authorities, who shut them down on a technicality, although it was probably because they thought the children were being exploited. When Wonderland went up, they had Cooney come out and visit, and they demonstrated that they did have a full-time hospital there, so that the children, there was no lack in the facilities, and they were never shut down. Cooney, by the way, kept these things going at various places into the 1940s. They had them at Coney Island and Atlantic City, by which time the hospitals were carrying incubators, and he said that his work had been done. The interesting part is that Cooney, it turns out, probably never did get a medical degree. 2 biographies have come out about him in recent years. But the doctors who specialize in this still look up to him. They think that he did a really great job of promoting the use of these. Next to the incubators, you can actually see it over the fence there in the background, was William H. Kennedy's Wild West Show and Indian Congress. William H. Kennedy was one of these cowboy showmen. A lot of the people who became famous cowboys in the Silence got their start with his company. And he had a collection of Cheyenne, Tuscarora, and Sioux Indians, the leader of which was Chief Toughfeather, who claimed to have been at Little Bighorn, and probably was. I found what's probably his name in the lists. They put on not only Indian shows and cowboy shows, they also had a Roman chariot race and a number of other things. On the opposite side was the descent into the Hell Gate. This was the designed by a fellow named Attilio Pusterla, who had probably worked with Voltaire, which is maybe the reason that they got this ride. He also was the park designer for the exteriors. And he had been trained at the Italian equivalent of the School of Beaux-Arts. He also went on to become an inventor, and he invented, among other things, rides. And fortunately, we have the patent drawing, so we know what this looks like inside. This is a top-down view. You have a spiral trough filled with water there, right over here, in the center of which was something that was probably done as a spire of rock. The walls are decorated as if they are the interior of a cave. And you had a tank over here with a pump that was furiously pumping water into this, because this spiral canted downwards, so the water would continue to run all the way down into the center, going faster and faster, and would carry the boats with it. You get into the boat and you'd go down into the center of apparently a whirlpool. When you got to the center over here, you suddenly dropped down to the lower level that's shown this dashed line, and then you'd follow below underneath. And this was decorated like the underworld with stalactites and stalagmites, and people dressed as demons and creatures of the underworld. And they would take you along, and then, as with a Disney ride, they would take you out over here and they would lead you before the throne of the devil himself. And then you would go out. In the meantime, your car would go back up here, your boat would go back up here and be carried back up to the beginning to start over again. Here's a side view. You can see the trough and the thing going down, and here it drops down to the lower level. Next to that was the restaurant and ballroom. This is the largest ballroom in New England, which is saying something, because a lot of the hotels along Revere Beach were mainly noted for their ballrooms. People would come there just to dance, and this was just one of the attractions at Wonderland. The restaurant was in the downstairs. It was run by Duncan MacDonald, who ran restaurants in what's now the downtown crossing area, specializing in serving meals to the shoppers there. This is a portion of the front. This is not the entire restaurant by any means, but this shows you what it looked like. They had 250 tables. They could serve 1,000 people at a time, and they specialized in shore dinners, what we would call lobster bakes. And this is a picture giving you a better idea of how large this is. Upstairs, you had the ballroom here. William S. Poole and his orchestra were here. It was very well ventilated, which is important for a ballroom in the summer. And they had a dancing master who would teach you how to dance if you didn't know how to dance, because they wanted to make sure everybody was being entertained there. Next to that was the beautiful Orient. A lot of the amusement parks and a lot of the World's Fairs had things like the Streets of Cairo to give you a taste of the exotic Orient. As you can see, they had a bazaar here. They had a Turkish restaurant. They had Turkish wrestlers. There were camels. There's a barn for camels in the back. And they had what they called muscle dancers, what we would call belly dancers, which was somewhat scandalous at the time. Here's a view that shows some of the camels over here. They would perform the dance of Damascus, the belly dancers. Next to this, here's that. Next to this was the Lamarcus A. Thompson Scenic Railway. Lamarcus A. Thompson wasn't the inventor of the roller coaster, but he had a sort of proto-roller coaster. Here's the building shown from the side. And this is from that conceptual sketch. This is what the Scenic Railway looked like. It had a very gentle up and down curve. I thought when I first saw this that the guy who painted it didn't know what it looked like, but I've seen pictures, and indeed this is what the track looked like. You would go from the center, that building we showed there, go all the way down the track, go to this other building over here, where you went inside and they had scenes from Venice or from the Grand Canyon. That's the scenic part of the Scenic Railway. And then you'd come back out and go along another sinusoidal track all the way back again. So it was relatively gentle, but that was actually exactly what people then were looking for. Nobody wanted to have the really sudden twists and turns and the deep dives of a modern roller coaster. And next to that was one of the biggest attractions of Wonderland, the Fighting the Flames show, also called Fire and Flames. This is the only image I found of what the front of this might look like. And this front not only blocked the view from people who hadn't paid admission to it yet, it also seated the grandstand that would hold 3,500 people. And inside, over here, they had their own separate program for this. Inside, on 3 acres, they constructed a false city block. You had and they populated it with actors. You had salesmen over here. You had a pawn shop. You had a Chinese laundry. There were policemen, drunks. There was a Salvation Army troop that came through here, streetcars. And a fire would start in one of these buildings over here on the side. They would have shows twice a day. The one during the day was pretty exciting, but the one at night must have been spectacular when it was lit entirely by the fire. This is a painting of what it looked like. You can identify the buildings. And they had their own fire company made up of retired and temporarily unemployed firemen using the latest equipment. They had pumps, they had hook and ladder trucks, they had chemical trucks that didn't need a fire hydrant to plug into. They had ambulances, and they would send the ladders up here to rescue the people, and they would come out with one of those big nets that people would jump into. In fact, the actors who jumped into them were acrobats from the circus show, and it was a very spectacular show. To organize this, originally the fire and flame shows had grown out of trade shows in England and in Germany, but an ex-fire chief named George Consider Hale from Kansas City had organized one of his own. There was no connection to those for the St. Louis World's Fair, and it was so popular that it was immediately copied by the parks in Coney Island. So they figured for Wonderland, they had to copy their own as well. They got the services of James J. Armstrong, the biggest and most established agent in New York, and his second in command, William C. Manning, who actually put the show together. Manning was a fascinating character in his own right. He was from Kentucky, and he'd been training as a horseman. His horse fell and crushed his right leg, which you'd think would be the end of his career, but it was the start of a brand new one. He became a one-legged wrestler and a one-legged gymnast. He would wrestle people for money and almost always won. And he became a very accomplished gymnast. Later on, he took up with a fellow named Louis DeCroix, who was another one-legged gymnast, only he was missing his left leg. And the two of them would perform routines that could not be performed by acrobats who had both legs. They would trade jokes with each other, and they would do things like going over each other and spin around. And of course, without the one leg, they could do that, and somebody else who had both legs couldn't do it. They continued to perform for a long time until finally he was in his 40s and figured it was about time to move on to something less physically demanding, and became a well-respected agent. He put together several things for Wonderland and nearby. Okay, George Consider Hale invented something else. It was called Hale's Tours, and it went in a building that looked like this at Wonderland. And what it was what we would call a virtual reality ride. He had This is not from Wonderland, but this is a typical Hale's Tours building. He had the building built so that it resembled a railroad car, and it could be shaken, and you could blow in smoke, and you had railroad noises going on, and you had the feel of wind. That might be what these fans are up here for. But the real touch that made the whole thing was that the entire front wall of the car was a movie screen. And they would show movies that were taken from the front of real railroad cars. And they could change what the reels were, of course. So you could see what it looked like to be driving a trolley through New York City, or you could see what it looked like to be on a train going through the Midwest. And several of these are still in existence. There's a very famous one that was taken in San Francisco only a few days before the earthquake. But Hale's Tours were established in a number of places. They got a lot of people interested in movie theaters and movies, and they got a lot of movie theaters their start. Next to that were the Fatal Wedding and the theater. The Fatal Wedding was an illusion. A couple of people, a man and a wife, or a couple of sweethearts, would probably be volunteered by their friends. They'd be put up on stage, and they'd be in a set of coffins, and then they would apparently turn into skeletons. Fatal Wedding, by the way, was the name of a popular play at the time, which is why they call it this. This attraction had been in Coney Island the year before. They just moved the whole thing over. And what it probably was something called Pepper's Ghost. You had a partially reflecting mirror here in the front. People couldn't see the edges, didn't realize it was there. And you would have this skeleton in darkness. The people would be in bright light, and what they would do is they'd bring the lights down on the people and up on the skeleton. They would seem to be like a movie dissolve into the skeleton. Then they would turn them back again. The theater for the first month had Gillette's Dog and Monkey Circus. That was mainly for the children. They had things like chimpanzees that would bowl other monkeys at a set of pins and things like that. After the first month, they changed over to a musical review called The South Before the War, which was one of these idyllic things there where you had happy slaves singing on the plantation. But that was a different time. That sort of thing was considered respectable. Nearby was Love's Journey. This was a sort of tunnel of love, but it wasn't what we think of as a tunnel of love. It was a brand new invention. In fact, the patent hadn't even been granted on it. It was invented by a guy by Herbert H. Patee, who was a Broadway actor only a couple of years before. He quit the stage in 1903, and he decided he was going to be an inventor. He was going to invent furniture, but he got seduced by amusement park rides. He invented several that fortunately were never built, but this is one of the ones they built that was. And it had a series of hammock-like cars that could either be suspended or they could float in the water like boats, or they could go from being suspended in the air to being in the water. He built an ingenious series of transitions here between each of the sections. You see 8 segments here, but the one in Wonderland actually had 20 of them. And each of the segments here was decorated in a different fashion. They are all supposed to inspire love or sweet feelings between the people on the ride. They also had these designed so that the cars could be moved from the outside. They could rock them back and forth and swing the people into each other. Patee went to go see this set up. This is the very first installation of it, and to see if there needed to be anything changed. And he saw Mabel Simons from Swampscott get onto the ride. And he said to the people with him, "I'm going to marry her." And the third time she got on the ride, he got on with her. And shortly after that, he proposed, and they got married on January 1st the following year. Here's one of the cars. He took out a design patent on the cars. And here is Patee with Mabel Simons. I suspect this is the decoration on the interior of one of the segments of the tunnel there. Nearby was Harry G. Travers' Circle Swing. This had 6 or 8 cars that would swing around faster and faster. This turned out to be a very big seller. It was the basis of his empire. He went on to invent a whole bunch of rides, including things like the Caterpillar, which are still around today. And he also built roller coasters. He built 2 of them on Revere Beach. He built the Lightning, which was an all-steel roller coaster in the 1930s when most people were still making out of wood, and the Cyclone, which was still on Revere Beach up until the last part of it was taken down in 1974. There, nearby, they had something called the Whirl, and there was a carousel too, both owned by Louis Bopp, who owned other attractions on the beach. We don't have any pictures of those, unfortunately, probably because they were owned by somebody outside the park. But here's the exterior of the carousel building next to the descent into the Hell Gate. And here's what the Whirl looked like where it was invented at Luna Park in Coney Island. You had these 4 cars again, and they would slowly rotate, and while they rotated, the whole thing went up. So you would follow a helical path up to the top and then back down again. That was invented by J.H. Welch, who was the master mechanic at Luna Park. And he later franchised this out to traveling shows as well. Nearby, they had a Japanese village. This is another part of their trying to be like a World's Fair kind of thing. They even had their own Mount Fuji that was about 80 feet tall, made out of canvas. Inside this, they had a Japanese house, very much like the one that they have here at the Children's Museum in Boston. You also had women dressed in kimonos, mostly local women. They had shops that sold ices and tea and rice cakes. There was a jiu-jitsu demonstration, and at least the first year, they had a lecture about the Russo-Japanese War, which had just been ended the year previously by a treaty signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, only about 50 miles away. There's the Mount Fuji. You can see some of the bridges they had here. And here's the circle swing. Here's the Japanese village. Nearby, they had the palmistry and astrology hut with the big hand on it. And they had the third degree, which was the funhouse. The palmists were Virginia Knapp and Princess Estrella Daly. They're shown here holding one of the babies from the infant incubators. And here's the front of the third degree. This went through several different names. It was called the Foolish House at first, also called the House of Follies, the Temple of Mirth. This character was the characteristic imbecile at the time, and you can see he's got a lot of things in common with Alfred E. Newman. He's got the jug handle ears, and he's missing a tooth in the front. He's dressed up in a top hat with a great big flower, because I suspect this is supposed to be his wedding day, and he's being claimed by 2 different women. Next to that was, the first year was Princess Trixie, the Equine Paradox. She was a clever Hans kind of horse. She could apparently add, subtract. She had her own cash register. She could make change. She could spell. It turned out that all the things she was doing was actually being subtly cued by her trainer rather than by her being intelligent. But there were a lot of such intelligent horses in fairs and attractions at the time. And next to that was Colonel Ferrari's Wild Animal Show. He was actually Giacomo Ferrari, and like the Kennedys, it was a family act. There were other Ferraris elsewhere. They specialized in wild cats, especially mixed breed wild cats, like a lion and tiger cross as a liger, very much like the wild cat show they have at King Richard's Fair. And at the end of the lagoon was the Arcus Ring, where they had circus acts. You can see it's set up with a high wire here. They had trapeze there. They would have acrobats, and they would have clowns, and the ringmaster in the center who would sing things. One of the things he would sing would be the Wonderland songs, which is what you heard when you were coming in to the show. That was specially commissioned to publicize Wonderland. Also, marching around the park twice a day, you had Jean Massoud and the Salem Armory Cadet Band that would be playing different musical compositions, including those songs. So there was a lot going on here at the park. This was the Beaver Street beachside entrance, and they built a special bridge for it. They had to build a bridge over the railroad tracks. This is very much like and about the same length as the pedestrian bridge near Wonderland Station. In fact, it was about 300 yards south of where that bridge is now. This is the fire insurance map that was made prior to its opening. The park didn't look quite like this, but it's pretty close. You can see the boardwalk here I was telling you about. A lot of these parks were very subject to dangers of fire. Wonderland was not going to do that. Wonderland had fire hydrants and water pipes running all over the park. It was made with special fireproof construction. There was asbestos incorporated into the buildings so they wouldn't burn. Two of the amusement parks at Coney Island eventually burned to the ground, but there was never a serious fire at Wonderland. In addition to all that, they all had their own fire department, which was separate from the one for the Fighting the Flames, that actually helped with fires in Revere. This is the only contemporary map of Wonderland I've been able to find. This is the Sanborn Fire Insurance map, and everything here is to scale, so you can see how big it was. In addition to the things I've described, there were a lot of individual attraction huts throughout. There was an arcade over here, a penny arcade. There was a shooting gallery here. They had a barber. They had a hairdresser. They had things selling ice cream and sodas and other food. They had games of chance throughout. So there was an awful lot going on at Wonderland. Here's a schematic diagram labeling what some of the things are. One of the things that made Wonderland particularly attractive was that the entire park was lit up. They had hundreds of thousands of lights at a time when a lot of people didn't have electricity. Wonderland used as much electric power as a Massachusetts town. And some of the postcards and photographs reflect this. You can see this is what the main Walnut Street entrance looked like. This is the Walnut Street entrance from the inside. This is the arcade over here, the theater, the Fatal Wedding. This is the Beach Street entrance. This is a view from the end of the lagoon looking up at the chutes, with the Shoot-the-Chutes. This isn't a tower, that's the slide. And this is the bridge running across the lagoon. Here are some other pictures. This is the beautiful Orient over here and the restaurant over here. And this is the view from the top of the Shoot-the-Chutes ride. Okay, now two other things, special things happened that first year. One is the Ryan Scintillator. This is Walter Darcy Ryan. He was the director of research at the Thomas Houston Electric Company that merged with Thomas Edison's company to form General Electric. General Electric was just starting out then, and you'd think that they would be a really big player, but they were never even approached by Wonderland when they were wiring up the park. And in fact, General Electric lost out on the contract for the St. Louis World's Fair to their competitor Westinghouse. So Ryan wanted to make sure they got the next big fair. There was one coming up in 1907 at Hampton Roads, Virginia, the Jamestown exhibition, and he wanted them to get that. So he arranged to have something spectacular to show off General Electric's ability. This was the scintillator. And this is from 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. I use this one because it's a color picture that shows you what it looked like. Here's another one. What these were, they had these special steam generators set up. You can see them off to the side there. And they had individually swivelable searchlights, each of which had changeable color filters on them. And each of these could be moved in any direction. They were controlled, in this case, by a company of Marines directed by hand signals and whistles. And these lights would move all over the place in unison with each other. Ryan invented the light show. And he could make these crisscross, make plaid patterns. They had things called the Fighting Dragons and other such. They would set off fireworks in the middle of this to disrupt it. It was, they called it flameless fireworks, and it was a very spectacular exhibition. The first time he did it, they set it up at Bass Point in Nahant, across Broad Sound from where Wonderland was. They put up this sort of Christmas tree steam generator here, and they had only 6 searchlights on a platform here with gel filters covered in marine varnish, so they'd be immune to the steam. And this is a picture of what it looked like when they had it running. They thought they'd run it for about a week. People came to see it, and it was so popular they ran it for over 50 days continuously. It was so popular, it was drawing people away from Wonderland, and Floyd C. Thompson was furious. He tried to get it stopped. He tried to wash out the light with the searchlights from Wonderland. That didn't work. He tried all sorts of things, and finally he did the only thing that he could. He bought it. So, or rather the use of it at least. So for the part of the last month that Wonderland was open, the scintillator, instead of drawing people away, was drawing people towards Wonderland. And they extended the season just to get their money worth out of it. Other weird story. Floyd C. Thompson saw that, was attracted by one of the attractions that they had there temporarily. This is him in between the Hell's Gate and the carousel. One of the things they had was Professor Joseph LaRue, really Joseph Croy from upstate New York, who used to perform on a trapeze bar slung underneath a balloon, and then at the end would jump off on a parachute. For Wonderland, he had his wife doing this, his wife, Tiny LaRue, and another local woman who agreed to do it. And they would go up 2,000 feet or more and jump off with these parachutes and float down to Earth, often landing quite a ways away. Thompson saw this and figured I could do that. So to the horror of the other park officials, he agreed to do it, and they insisted on him being tied onto the trapeze bar, which is a good thing because when Professor LaCroix set off the pistol, the starting pistol, the balloon started with such a jerk that Thompson was jerked off the thing and was only held on by his hands tied onto the bar. And he had to stay until it went up to 2,000 feet before he could safely jump off. And it took a while before he could finally do that. When he did, he started coming down right onto the railroad tracks running near the park, and a train was coming by. He was able to swing from side to side until he came down off the tracks. The people came out, carried him back in triumph, his arms in the air because he couldn't put them down. They took them back to the hospital, and they massaged his arms for a while. He said he'd go up again, but he never did. And that was the end of the first year. The second year was rather different. One of the things that's fascinating about Wonderland is that the exhibits changed very completely from year to year. Changes in personnel, changes in attractions. The biggest change was that Floyd Thompson wasn't there anymore. Floyd Thompson had tried to build another park only a few miles up Revere Beach at Point of Pines called Vanity Fair. And when the people from Wonderland found out about it, they fired him, and the board from Vanity Fair fired him as well. He ended up running an amusement out in Seattle called Eden Musée, about as far from Boston as you can get. Joseph Higgins took over his position, and they promoted the tour director to be the general manager, which is probably a good break for him. He was an entertainer, and this gave him something else to do. The beautiful Orient, the building remained the same, but they changed it to the Florida Alligator Jungle. The Children's Theater became Willard's Temple of Music. The Fatal Wedding left and was replaced by Under the Sea. Hales Tours, they broke the contract with Hales Tours. They were no longer a Hales Tours. They became the Rocky Mountain Holdup. And they put in a brand new building where Princess Trixie had been, called Battle Abbey. They also installed a real roller coaster, the Velvet Coaster, behind where the carousel was. And they put up a $10,000 pavilion for the Salem Cadet Band to play in. The first 2 weeks of the park, they had Lincoln Beachy, an aeronaut who was just barely out of his teens. He flew a balloon he called the Rubber Cow. This was filled with hydrogen, and this is a gasoline motor underneath, which is kind of scary. He'd made his name by buzzing the White House the year before, and he also had flown through New York City. But for his appearance at Wonderland, he flew all the way over to the State House and back again, almost getting lost in the fog. Warren Frazee was Alligator Joe. You had an alligator show with hundreds of alligators down in Miami. He was spotted by Duncan McDonald, the restaurant guy, and this Alligator Joe wanted a franchise, so he came up to Boston, bringing with him lots of crocodiles, alligators, and a pregnant sea cow. And you can see a turtle here on top of the sea cow. He was a raconteur. He used to sit out front and regale people with stories of his adventures with the alligators. The manatee gave birth, and unfortunately both the mother and the baby died. But this shows you a picture of the attraction as the alligator farm. You can see it's this crocodile farm here, sea cow, Alligator Joe. Here's another picture of it. Charles D. and Kitty Willard were consummate musicians. They invented their own instruments with weird names like the flukemizer and the harmonium, and they used to play them and in intriguing ways. A lot of things were run with electricity, and one of his big attractions was the musical sawmill. He used to have a company of women dressed in sort of proto-steampunk gear, playing songs on sawmills, each of which had a different tone. And to make it really exciting, they were charged with electricity so that they gave off colored sparks. Years later, his electrical equipment was inherited by a guy named Kenneth Strickfaden, who went on to build the laboratory equipment for the movie Frankenstein, among other things. An associate of Willard's was Robert Blake, who had an animal circus. They had performed at least 3 places together. He replaced the Ferrari brothers with his dog and pony circus. Where the Feta wedding had been, they put in Under the Sea. They put in basically a giant aquarium with a very thick-walled glass tank. And they put in, recruited Fred Wallace, a local salvage diver, to go down there and demonstrate his diving suit. They also had Eugene Fields, the human fish who could stay underwater for minutes at a time and eat underwater. They had an escape artist like Harry Houdini who had escaped from handcuffs underwater, and they had some female swimmers. Where a pony track went in, where the Wild West show had been, you can see the chute here in the background. And around the outside of that, they put a miniature railroad, much like Walt Disney himself would later build. Where it passed under the grandstand, they made that a tunnel. And the big musical show they started that year, Alice in Wonderland, it seems sort of obvious from the name. They had people dressed up as all the Alice in Wonderland characters. They had music that went along with it. At nighttime, they would be lit with lights. It would be like Disney's Main Street Electrical Parade. And they would sing various songs. 1908 was the biggest year of the park, arguably. Again, they changed things. The Florida Alligator Jungle became Darktown. They finally got rid of the Fighting the Flame show. It's at most of the parks elsewhere in the country. This only lasted about 2 years. So they replaced it with a Western set, and this became Pawnee Bill's Wild West show for that summer. The Temple of Music became Paradise, the show Beautiful. Battle Abbey became the Human Laundry. And Under the Sea became Pilgrim's Progress, which was another funhouse. Blake Circus was replaced by Darling Circus. And the Rocky Mountain Holdup that had been where Hales Tours was became The World in Motion with the new attraction Humanovo. Humanovo turned out to be actors standing behind the screen shouting the lines so that silent movies now had voices. And where the pony track had been, they put in a roller skating rink. One of the big attractions was Annette Kellerman that year, the Australian mermaid. She was famous as a woman who had the first woman to try to swim the English Channel, and she'd won several competitions. She was also very popular doing demonstrating different strokes and dives. And She was very famous. She'd been featured in the Revere newspaper the year before she came to Wonderland. For the show Beautiful, they had women going around the park handing out these tickets with the provocative, "I am single, are you?" on it. But it's basically just inviting you to come to Paradise, the show Beautiful. The only information I have about what was the show in the show Beautiful are things like this ad. Apparently it was a combination beauty show and talent show. They had serpentine dancers, a lady for poses, must be good form and good looking, fire dancer, Spanish dancer, statue turning to life, and lady up front for the ballyhoo to entice people in. Unfortunately, this show doesn't seem to have continued after that year. The Human Laundry was a ride where you basically went through a laundromat and you were treated like a piece of laundry. You didn't get wet, of course, but they took you to the Mangler. There was the boiler. This is a franchised ride, so I know what it was like from appearances in other parks. One of the things they had at the one in Wonderland you didn't hear was a bluing room. You went through the wringer, the dryer, and finally you're expelled down a laundry chute. Here's a cartoon that shows people being wrung out and down the chute. Darktown is another one of those things like the South before the war, presented one of those idyllic scenes of the life before the war. You had musical performers. You had the Darktown Fire Brigade. This was organized by W.C., who had done the Fire and Flame show. And they also built 2 miniature steamboats, and they had a steamboat race in the canals, and the boiler would blow up on one of the ships. They also had 22 inches tall. She was a cause célèbre because she had run away from Bostock's show and eloped with one of the musicians, and Bostock had reclaimed her, and her husband wanted her back. They had a big trial in Boston that everybody made the newspapers about 2 years before Wonderland. Eventually, she and her husband escaped from Bostock again and struck out on their own, which is where they were at Wonderland. Here's Annette Kellerman in her form-fitting bathing suit, which again was considered somewhat scandalous. There was a story that was circulated that when she went out onto Revere Beach, she was arrested for her indecent bathing attire. And this was repeated in the biography that was the movie of her life, $1 Million Mermaid, that starred Esther Williams, where she defended herself in court saying, "Look, I can't swim in those things with all those fripperies on it. I need a form-fitting suit." Unfortunately, the story is not true. There is no police record of her being arrested. There are no newspaper stories about it. And the first time the story was told, it was by Kellerman herself. She did, besides doing demonstrations at the park, she tried to swim out to Boston Light, did not quite do it, unfortunately. She judged swimming contests, and she demonstrated the Diavolo. She advocated Diavolo tennis as a way to keep in shape. She was staying with H.H. Pattee and his wife. She'd been introduced to them by Higgins's wife. And after the fair closed, Maybelle sued her husband for divorce, claiming that he was spending too much time with Annette Kellerman. They were sitting around late at night drinking beer and eating crackers. And when Kellerman learned about this, she was shocked because she would never drink beer and eat crackers. She said that would be terrible for her figure. The real problem, I think, was that Pattee was twice the age of his wife, and there was just a lot of strain there. He didn't contest the divorce. But I suspect that Annette started the story about the bathing suit as a cover for this, just say, well, yes, there was some problem, but it was just me in my bathing suit. Here's Pawnee Bill with his Wild West show. They built log cabins and teepees, and they too had Sioux Indians. They had a lot of cowboys. They had stagecoaches. This is the back of the backdrop you can see here behind the scenic railway, and a collection of Sioux Indians. And they also had Australian who demonstrated boomerangs and other such things. 1908 was probably the most successful year they had, but unfortunately at the end of it, the park was bankrupt. So they had to put the place in sale the next year. This is Wonderland from the next year. You can see that it's looking somewhat distressed. The incubator sign is gone. You can see the rides are gone. The eagle's even gone from over here. They put the park up for auction. They sold it for $50,000, but the purchaser was Higgins. The $1 million park sold for $50,000, and the creditors had to be satisfied with 5 cents on the dollar, which is how they got out of debt. The park closed down an awful lot of things. They had operated on a very austere budget. They replaced all the circus acts with vaudeville shows, which were much less expensive. And for a big show that year, they had Cinderella and the Golden Slipper, directed by James Gilbert, who did the Harvard Hasty Pudding shows, among other things. And they had continually changing series of songs that went in. They continuously changed the cast too. And these shows were participation shows. This was by a little known at the time fellow named Irving Berlin. It was his first big success, and the audience was joined with the hurrah part. Later on, they did My Pony Boy. Bruce Springsteen sings this, by the way, in one of his albums. And Sadie Salome Go Home, another Irving Berlin song that was a big hit for a performer named Fania Baruch, who became better known as Fanny Brice. And here's a souvenir golden slipper from Cinderella. They actually turned a profit. They would reopen in 1910, but they weren't doing as well. They brought the infant incubators back. They had been gone. They brought back Gilbert as the assistant manager. They replaced the Beautiful Orient thing with Wonder Wander, which is a self-running ride for basically toddlers. No big musical this year. And they put in a diving show in the Kellerman tank. The big attraction that year was a captive balloon. You could pay a hefty sum and be taken up in a balloon. You didn't have to come down by parachute. And we have a description of what that was like. They'd go up there for a couple of minutes. They had the garden scene from Faust. They had a couple of billiard masters. And the big attraction for that summer, besides the balloon, was Matt Henson, the first man to the North Pole. He had accompanied Peary, but Peary's feet were too badly frostbitten. So it was Henson and the 4 Inuit guides who were the first ones to actually go to the pole. He went there with movies. He went to Wonderland with movies, slideshows, and probably a sled and the clothes that he wore, and gave a lecture on it. And it's at least partial recompensation, I think, that after all of the incredibly racist things that they'd had earlier on in the park's history, they were able to end up with a very positive show of Matt Henson demonstrating what could be done. And they had diving girls in the tank where Annette Kellerman had been. And if you'll notice here, it was Patty who brought them in there. And then Wonderland finally closed. They actually sold the balloon while the park was still going. And it ended its season in 1910. And that's when the park closed for good. And I think I should probably stop it there because it's almost 7 o'clock. These are just some of the souvenirs from Wonderland. And this is where Wonderland is today. This is the Wonderland Marketplace Mall across Route 1A from where the Wonderland dog track had been. But as you can see, most of the buildings from the park were actually either in the mall itself or its parking lot. In fact, they built these buildings precisely where the Wonderland buildings had been, probably because they had the pilings in here to give them a solid footing. Okay. And there are a couple of websites you can go to. If you go to Lost Wonderland, there are a lot of pictures there. If you go to this, you find some of my other writings. Okay. So I guess we can take some questions now. How are we going to work this? Let me hit stop share. Okay. I see some people have been typing in questions. Unfortunately, I haven't had chat up, so I couldn't see these. My maternal grandmother worked at Wonderland. Oh, I'd love to know more information about that. If you can get in touch with me, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, we did record the talk and it'll be available later.
Mm-hmm.
We'll send everyone the link.
Was that building a cyclorama? I assume that's referring to the Battle Abbey. If it wasn't, let me just say, Battle Abbey wasn't a cyclorama, but the guy who painted the cycloramas, Paul Philippito, was the guy who painted all the paintings in Battle Abbey. They showed different battle scenes, an awful lot of them from the career of Ulysses S. Grant. Admission to the park, 10 cents, I believe. But some of the attraction cost 5 cents or 10 cents. The Velvet Coaster was 5 cents. It was at least 10 cents to get into the Fire and Flame show. Let's see. Insurance company. I don't know. Insurance is one of the things, by the way, that McCann covered along with his real estate business. They may have gotten it through McCann. Let's see. What was the human laundry? Well, I explained what the human laundry was. It was a franchised ride where they treated you like some laundry. If you read the book, I have the description from the Cambridge Chronicle that describes what it was like to go through that. None of the things on the beach were part of the park. Wonderland, as I say, was where the Wonderland Marketplace Mall was. It wasn't on the beach, which ultimately contributed to its downfall. Even though they had a bridge over from the beach, and you can experience exactly what that was like by walking the pedestrian bridge at Wonderland, people didn't want to go that far. They would rather go see the attractions on the beach along Revere Beach Boulevard than walk the extra steps to get to Wonderland Park. In order to drag people in, they had to have something spectacular, but spectacular things cost money, and they couldn't afford the money during the last 2 years of the park. So it was a brutal cycle, and led them closing the park down at the end of the 1910 season. By the way, if you look online, they'll tell you that the park closed in 1911, but it didn't. I can prove it closed in 1910. What ride at the park would you have liked to try? I really would have loved to have tried the Shoot-the-Chutes. I don't know if anybody who's got anything quite like that. A lot of the other rides still exist. You can ride on something very much like the circle swing. There are things kind of like the Whirl-the-Whirl. But I don't know of anybody who's got one that really gets you up to speed the way that the Shoot-the-Chutes did. Crescent Park. I don't know about Crescent Park, I'm afraid. There were a lot of attractions on Crescent Beach, but I haven't even heard of a Crescent Park. Fill it in. Well, they didn't fill it in. Like I said, they built the park on a boardwalk over the marsh, so they didn't have to fill anything in. Later on, they must have filled it in because, of course, it doesn't flood there anymore. There isn't a marsh there anymore. But I have no idea exactly when they did that. It was a quarter of a century between the time the amusement park closed and the dog park opened, because the dog park opened about 1936. In between, they had a miniature golf course there. They had a bicycle track, circle track in there. And people had other things that would happen on those grounds. Being too expensive to operate. It's not the public's taste changes. Like I said, people were too lazy to walk out there. A lot of people who had things at Wonderland eventually built things on the boulevard and ended up in competition with Wonderland. The Temple of Music put up something on the boulevard. Blake Circus put up something there. Louis Bopp had a lot of things on the boulevard. Patty operated an small amusement park on the boulevard. So people just didn't want to come that far, and anybody who could move their stuff outside. There was a big attraction called the Monitor and the Merrimack. It was a reconstruction of the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack. And when that came to Revere Beach, it set up on the boulevard. In previous years, that would have been something that operated at Wonderland. So I don't know exactly why it was, but people just didn't want to go there anymore. And that's what made it too expensive. If you don't have people coming in all the time, you can't afford to have the big showy attractions. Reports of injuries or fatalities. No, as far as I know, nobody got seriously hurt or injured who was a visitor to the park. One fellow who worked at the park, two people who worked at the park, had gotten injuries there. One guy who worked with the mechanical systems underneath the Shoot-the-Chutes actually lost his arm, and he sued Wonderland Park for it. But as far as I know, nobody who was a visitor to the park was ever injured on a ride or anywhere else in the park. Any famous people visited the park? Unfortunately, I can't think of anybody famous at the time. There were a lot of famous people who were peripherally involved with the park, and you can read about some of them in the book. William Howard Taft visited Revere Beach, but he never visited Wonderland Park. How many people worked there? Ah, good question. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know how many people. It probably changed from year to year, but there are quite a few of them. They had ticket taker girls. They had people who ran the stands. They had the nurses and doctors. They had a local police force for themselves. They had their own fire engine, fire department. During the Fire and Flames, they had a fire department. They had people who ran the food stands, and just a huge number of people. I would say several hundred. Any relationships in the establishment of Kennywood in Pennsylvania and Wonderland? They opened about the same time. No, I think that's just coincidence. One of the things that astonished me is that there were Wonderlands that opened all over the country at this time, and a lot of them had very similar attractions. They all had Shoot-the-Chutes, for instance. But that's because everybody had to have the Shoot-the-Chute because the big attractions in Coney Island did. And there were a lot of Wonderlands because Dreamland in Coney Island was originally going to be called Wonderland. But it was simply everybody copying the leaders of the industry. There are people who claim that Disneyland maybe got some of its inspiration from Wonderland, but I can't find any indications that this was the case. Nobody who had been associated with Massachusetts was involved in the founding of Wonderland, the founding of Disneyland. And as I say, there's so many of these parks that were so similar, they probably could have gotten the idea from one of those other parks. One thing I find particularly fascinating is the guy who built Disneyland is a fellow named Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood. And there are a lot of parallels between him and Floyd C. Thompson. Wood later went on to build amusement parks elsewhere in the country, including Freedom Land in New York, which I visited as a kid, and Pleasure Island here in Massachusetts, up in Wakefield, which lasted the longest of any of the parks that he'd built outside of Disneyland. It lasted for a whole 10 years. How did the birding building attraction work? The buildings were repeatedly. Yes, they were. They had, most of the building was fireproof. And I don't know for a fact, but I would be betting that they put in there bales of burnable material that would show a very spectacular looking flame, but wouldn't actually do much damage to the building. At Freedom Land, which I'd mentioned, they had something actually similar. They had, when you visited the section that was supposed to be Old New York, you would be able to help, Chicago, you would be able to help the Chicago Fire Department put out the Chicago fire. You could work a pump engine. But what they had was a building that had propane jets along the windows where the flames would come out. This was kind of like that, only with something burnable instead of propane. I imagine the fact that you were setting off large and very hot fires several times a day probably weakened the buildings, which was one of the things that probably limited the lifetime of the attraction to only about 2 years. So good ferry, penny ferry. Yes. Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of other things about the penny ferry and the narrow gauge railroad that I relied on. There are several books and articles about this you can reference. And I'm impressed your grandfather was a captain on it. Wonderland Ballroom. All right, there are two Wonderland Ballrooms. There was a Wonderland Ballroom at Wonderland Park, which was located straddling Route 1A between the parking lot of the Wonderland Marketplace Mall and where the Wonderland dog track was. And there's the Wonderland Ballroom that went up. I'm not exactly sure when. It was after the dog track, probably in the 1940s. That's still there, right next to Wonderland Station. The two have no connection with each other aside from the name, and they didn't occupy exactly the same plot of ground. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. That was very interesting. We really enjoyed that.
Okay.
Oh, here's something. Whalum Park. Oh.
Whalum Park. I'm afraid I don't know much about Whalum Park. It was still running when I came to Massachusetts, but I don't think I ever visited it. And it has no direct connection with this, at least. Whew. Oh, by the way, I wanted to point out that music that I had for the park there. I'll put it back on again here in the background, if you don't mind. This was actual music for the park. This was played by Riccardo Grissino at Berkeley College of Music for me. I really appreciate that. And as I say, this was publicity for the park. How did you become interested in researching this subject? Somebody asked. That is a long story. I've been curious about Revere Beach ever since I first came up here as an undergraduate and rode the Blue Line out to the end and walked up and down Revere Beach looking for the beach attractions and couldn't find any. And since then, I've been researching what was where and when it was there. There's a very complex story about how I got into writing a book about it, but basically it's because I thought there was a publisher who was very interested in the book. And when I finally wrote them the book proposal and they had to look over it, they suddenly decided they weren't interested in the book. But by that time, I was already hooked. I was already writing the book, and I had to finish it up. Unfortunately, the University of Massachusetts agreed to publish it. What was the survival rate of the babies? I'm afraid I don't know. I'd have to direct you to the 2 books that have come out about Dr. Coney. If you look him up, Couney, Dr. Martin Coney. There are 2 books out, one by Dawn Raffel and the other one by, I can't remember her name.
Okay, thanks again, everyone, for attending. Good night.
Good night.